The most influential games ever made were often built on the shoulders of their predecessors. Games that had similar ideas but lacked one or two vital details that later attempts implemented to make the whole thing resonate with the public. Genius is never appreciated in its time, as they say, and as such, these following great games all fell under the radar for a wide range of reasons. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 overlooked video games that were way ahead of their time. Number 8, Sleeping Dogs. The tragedy of Sleeping Dogs will never not sting. One of the more impressive open-world crime capers not called GTA, the original Hong Kong set action game was, living up to its name, a sleeper hit. Rather than try to match GTA at its own game, Sleeping Dogs attempted to blend slickly animated melee combat with regular third-person shooting mechanics, and while not the very first open-world game to try this difficult blend, it was one of the first to pull it off convincingly. Executing brutal combos only to dive into cover for a few headshots provided a thrill across the entirety of the runtime. And the thinking was, if these systems felt so fully formed in the first effort, then a sequel would only improve upon them. It was more than just the combat though, as Sleeping Dogs also cast you as an undercover cop, which was an interesting wrinkle to the sandbox formula, as you try to balance two different factions. Then there was its gorgeous open world, satisfying vehicle play, and surprisingly charming minigames. Which makes it all such a shame that Sleeping Dogs never got a proper sequel, with the franchise being killed before it ever got to reach its full potential. Number 7, Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark 2008 is not an amazing game, but it was at least trying to be. This much maligned reboot received a tepid response when it launched, but it shouldn't be written off as just one of many attempts from the gaming industry to badly modernize a classic horror series. That's because Alone in the Dark's two key selling points, those being its episodic TV-inspired narrative and incredible fire physics technology for the time, deserve a little more appreciation all these years later. When I say episodic structure, I mean that in the literal sense as well, as Alone in the Dark's narrative was designed to echo that of a TV show, with its twisted story being a season and its levels being individual episodes. Bafflingly, you could also complete them in any order you wanted to, a gimmick that has unfathomably been tried a couple of times since, despite the question always being, who the hell even watches a season of TV by just randomly jumping between episodes anyway, and why is that something we should try and emulate? Anyway, the point is, Alone in the Dark was just a bit too early for the prestige TV boom, as this cross-medium emulation would later help games like Alan Wake stand out from the crowd and become beloved cult hits. Not to mention the many Telltale games which thrived on episodic storytelling, or something as recent as Dusk Falls. Number 6, Far Cry 2. Despite Far Cry's status as one of Ubisoft's flagship franchises, the two entries pre-Far Cry 3 have been mostly forgotten by Ubisoft and fans of the series. And this is a shame in the case of 2 at least, since it is a really fun ride, and drastically ahead of the time in which it came out. Just one glance at the excellent Krobby Cat comparison video will show you just how much this second game was pushing the envelope in terms of interacting open world systems. From still mind-blowing fire technology to insanely detailed wildlife behavior for the time, on top of semi-realistic mechanics like gun degradation, Far Cry 2 tried to blend open world anarchy with the meticulous design of an immersive sim. And while some of these features would carry on throughout the series, many were just watered down rather than built upon as the franchise opted for scale over this frankly astonishing level of detail. Still, it paved the way for other tightly connected open world survival games to come, even if it's a shame that Ubisoft was so keen to throw all of these medium furthering ideas away. Number 5, Katamari Damacy. Katamari Damacy is one of the best physics-based games ever made, full stop. The premise is simple: you are tasked with restoring all of the stars to the sky. And you accomplish this via a ball that picks up any object smaller than it. The bigger the ball gets, the more stuff you can pick up, until you are quite literally rolling up the world. While its aesthetic was met with mainstream derision at the time, Katamari Damacy has since won over a strong cult following thanks to one of the most addictive gameplay loops ever. It's just so damn fun to roll up progressively bigger and bigger objects until you're picking up entire buildings, followed by entire islands, followed by entire continents. Just try not to think about all the puny mortals that were in those buildings, islands, and continents. I suppose if they didn't want to be rolled into a giant ball, then they shouldn't have made their deaths so hilarious. It's as simple as that. If you want one of the most fun physics-based games you'll ever play, then hunt down its recent remastering, Katamari Damacy Reroll on Steam, and enjoy the carnage. Kinda sounded like we were sponsored there. Absolutely not, that's just where you can play it. Number 4, Psychonauts. It will forever be a shame that poor project management caused Psychonauts to miss its shot at the big leagues. What put the game ahead of its time, rather than simply being an exemplary early 2000s platformer, was its pitch-black humor and its portrayal and exploration of mental health issues as a central gameplay gimmick. Granted, the former sometimes kneecapped the latter, but the fact that it was sincerely attempted at all in such an adolescent stage of the gaming industry was really something noteworthy. The gameplay itself, while dragging heavily in spots and suffering from the kind of roadblocking that plagues a lot of 3D platformers of this era, is a certified classic in the history of platformers. If you haven't played Psychonauts already, then fix that as soon as humanly possible, and then play the damn good sequel as well. Number 3, Doom 3. I love Doom 3, but it was admittedly a bitter pill to swallow for many fans at the time, being a huge departure from what many loved so much about the series in the first place. Rather than embrace the series' signature all-out carnage, the sequel was a more survival horror-based shooter, and you know what? It was amazing. Sure, the flow was completely different from where the series had come from and where it would go afterwards, but the more vulnerable protagonist, the revolutionary lighting effects, and the more terrifying take on classic Doom baddies paved the way for a lot of what would be implemented in Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. Except for the vulnerable protagonist part anyway. I mean, the Doom Slayer would eat these levels for breakfast, but I digress. Doom 3 was not what fans wanted from the third Doom game at all, which is why this entry has mostly been forgotten in favor of its sequels and its predecessors. But even if you don't love the gameplay in terms of revolutionizing video game lighting and presentation, Doom 3 did push the medium forward. Number 2, Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. Horror games are often destined for cult status, and few are cultier than Silicon Knights' masterpiece Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. Though we've had direct Lovecraft adaptations in the gaming space, it's usually the ones inspired by the author's work more generally that do the best job of evoking the texture of those books, and Eternal Darkness is up there with Bloodborne in this regard. It achieves this through the main gimmick of the sanity meter, a mainstay of Lovecraftian RPGs like Call of Cthulhu. But Eternal Darkness's take on its effects on gameplay is the most clever the mechanic has ever been utilized. See, if the meter goes down far enough, your character doesn't just start acting crazy and the screen doesn't just go a bit blurry, but the game itself starts to lose its mind. Textures will pop in at random, the screen goes all flickery, and then it begins playing tricks on you. Such as telling you that your save file is being deleted or turning the volume all the way down. This obviously provides all the more incentive to undo the damage to your sanity meter before it gets even worse. So Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem is the game to play if you just want to feel like you're losing your mind. Number 1, Legacy of Kain: Soul Reaver. If something is not done soon, then the Soul Reaver series will truly be lost to time, and we cannot allow that to happen. Soul Reaver was a triumph of a game series for its time, with many current titles still copying its gothic, thought-provoking homework. In the early days of the PS1, when games were still emerging into the risky, strange world of 3D, the Legacy of Kain series kicked the door down with Soul Reaver, a gothic tale of revenge, destiny, and the unbreakable wheel of causality and fate. The gameplay has not aged that well, granted, but it's not like other revolutionary games like GoldenEye 007 have any room to talk in that regard. Soul Reaver helped move the needle for gaming storytelling and then came back to do it even better for its sequels, and as a result, it's a genuine shame that so many modern gamers won't have experienced its brilliance, as there's a reason why the likes of our beloved Scott Tailford keep banging the drum for this game decades later.
It takes a lot of ingredients to make a good video game, but many might argue that the most important is the gameplay. Elements like the storyline, art direction, music, and graphical fidelity all of course play a big part in the flavoring, but at its core, a game needs to wow its audience with mechanics they enjoy. Unfortunately, not every game manages to find an audience, and that means that some genius mechanics fly under the radar. Well, no more. What Culture Gaming is here to do our bit to make sure these games get their due. I'm Ewan, and here are 10 criminally overlooked gameplay mechanics. Number 10. Sound-based gameplay. in silence. The use of microphones in gaming usually goes hand in hand with getting screamed at by salty players or gloating after beating your mates. Or, if you're playing as a medic in Hell Let Loose, getting to listen to the anguished screams of your comrades as they commit fully to the bit before being turned into goop before your very eyes. What a community. But, tragically, I am not here to talk about Hell Let Loose. Boo, I know. I'm actually here to shout out In Silence. This 2020 multiplayer indie horror revolves around proximity chat. You and your friends have to stay as silent as possible while you work together to escape or fight a terrifying monster inspired by the Rake creepypasta. If you've got loud friends, well, tough luck, buddy. You really don't want them on your team. One lucky player also gets to take on the role of the villainous beastie, who must hunt down their human prey with limited eyesight. The best way to find them is through headphones, keeping an ear out for chatting, whispering, or any sort of noise that may hint at their location. The human players can manipulate this system themselves by setting off radios, TVs, or other devices to distract the monster. Number 9. Only playable in one sitting. Paratopic. Even the hardest of games allow players the chance to save their progress. This means you can take a break, calm down, and maybe even buy a new controller after breaking the last one during your 100th attempt to beat Melania, Goddess of Rot. This is a judgment-free zone, I totally get it. But Paratopic, a unique indie title, said no to that luxury, forcing you into a whole new type of gaming experience. Paratopic is a bizarre and obtuse game that throws abstract storytelling and gameplay your way, but one of its most fascinating features is that you have to play it in one sitting. Yep, the game doesn't feature a save system, with the roughly 45-minute title forcing you to treat it like an episode of your favorite show. You put it on and play with no distractions. It's that, or you don't play it at all. Number 8. The drawbacks of specialized leveling. Disco Elysium. Those who have played Disco Elysium often give it credit for being one of the most well-written, yet chaotic role-playing experiences out there. You'll find no arguments here, as the game deserves its illustrious reputation. One feature that captures its cleverness and twisted psychology is how the protagonist's warped mind manifests in the gameplay. As with many RPG games, you might feel the urge to pour all your energy into one of your character's skill tree options. This is usually a smart choice, as you can specialize in a reliable trait that carries you throughout the game. But if you do this in Disco Elysium, you'll end up fighting a losing battle, as the lead detective's own sanity will wrestle itself out from under you. The more you rely on one branch of your skills, categorized as intellect, psyche, physique, and motorics, the more that part of your brain will take over. Soon, that aspect of your psychology will struggle against you, acting out without permission and introducing chaos into your playthrough. Number 7. Real-time healing. X-Men Origins Wolverine. One of the biggest immersion breakers in modern gaming is the role of healing. How is it that you can play an FPS and get riddled with bullets only for the main consequence to be a bit of jelly going in your eyes? It's almost like every character in games with regenerating health has the power of Marvel's Wolverine. And well, the legendary character seemed to note this as he said, "Hold my beer," and did it himself. 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine is one of those unique video game adaptations that outdid its cinematic source material. Although that was pretty easy given, well, it had this to work with. Getting the chance to hack and slash as the iconic Logan felt amazing, and what helped to sell it was the character's real-time healing mechanic. Developed by gone but not forgotten Activision studio Raven Software, who, while now saddled under the Call of Duty license, used to make some seriously banging Marvel games back in the day. I'll rescue you, my sweet, just as soon as I procure about 200 feet of rope, a plunger, about 3 pounds of pocket sand, yeah, and one of those screaming chickens. That'll do it. Origins Wolverine went into immense gory detail in its gameplay, with the titular hero getting torn to shreds the more damage you took. Of course, he would eventually heal back up, which you could watch in full. This mechanic delivered a spectacularly gruesome depiction of what immortality can buy you. Number 6. Creating art. Eastshade. Players will often picture a weapon in their hands when thinking of open-world titles. And this isn't an unfair leap, as almost every game in the medium follows a formula full of combat and action. Still, there are experiences out there that pull back on that aggression, and the criminally overlooked Eastshade is one of them. The game is a sequel to the short title Leaving Lindo, and it lets you play as a traveling painter who explores the titular island. Discovery and beauty are at the forefront of this unique title as you look around the land for scenes you want to put onto the canvas. Throughout the game, you use the painting mechanic to draw pictures, which you can then use to gain knowledge or items from NPCs. Players who fancy a change of pace after racking up kill streaks and grinding for lots of new armor sets will find everything they want in the peaceful gameplay of this underrated gem. Number 5. Gravity Manipulation. Gravity Rush. If you ever encounter a person in the street who screams out conspiracy theories and claims that gravity is weighing humanity down, then the good news is that you can show them a world where it doesn't. Of course, that world is a video game, and that anti-gravitational sentiment is simply an underrated mechanic. Gravity Rush is an action-adventure game for the PS Vita that puts you in the very light shoes of a young girl who can manipulate gravity. If that mechanic sounds fun, then, well, you're right on the money, because it definitely is. The gravity manipulation mechanic in this game allows you to switch the force off, flinging yourself around the map and soaring through the skies. It's the kind of open world navigation that's so addictive you'll never even consider using fast travel again. You can use it to roam around the environment, solve puzzles, and produce creative combat attacks, providing hours of fun at the expense of good old Sir Isaac Newton. Number 4. Gardening-based platforming. The Gardener and the Wild Vines. In The Gardener and the Wild Vines, you play as a gardener, no surprises there, who sets out on a journey to rescue their beloved prince. To do so, you scale towers with a deeply creative platforming system that sees you cutting flowers with your shears to create branching vines. These vines produce leaves you can bounce on, carrying you further to more flowers. You'll encounter more and more challenges as you play on, but the one thing that won't change within the roughly 3 to 4 hour runtime is the satisfying feeling of mixing platforming with shearing. This is a cute, creative, and inspired narrative platformer that is certainly deserving of more attention. Number 3. Deck building turn-based combat. Marvel's Midnight Suns. This tactical role-playing game from Firaxis Games, the developer known for Civilization and XCOM, boasts an impressive roster full of some of the most popular Marvel characters going. On top of that is an excellent combat system that combines the developer's signature turn-based gameplay with deck-building mechanics. This creates a wholly unique system for battling that feels like a healthy combination of XCOM and Marvel Snap. Each mission sees the player bring 3 characters into battle. These heroes are dealt with 8 customizable cards that grant them attacks and abilities. They are then placed into a deck and drawn per round, making for unique builds, strong strategy plays, and an element of unpredictability. Despite racking up a decent critical response though, Marvel's Midnight Suns sadly fell victim to low sales, meaning not many people got to appreciate the brilliant combat on offer. Number 2. The Nemesis System. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Enemies in video games are usually tailor-made by the developers. This often works great, as well-crafted, memorable villains leave nothing for players to complain about. But what if there was a system where every player got to forge their own path with unique rivals and recurring characters? Oh, wait, there is. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor and its sequel, Shadow of War, drummed up considerable buzz for its take on J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings mythos, and for its incredible Nemesis system. This unique gameplay mechanic allowed you to run into procedurally generated orcs and goblins. This led to the creation of plenty of unique characters, as your choices, failings, and wins would make considerable marks on the enemies you faced. Sadly though, the Nemesis system has gone nowhere. There should be a whole boatload of AAA projects using this mechanic, and yet you won't even use up all your fingers when you count them on your hand. This isn't even a matter of missed opportunity by creators, as the finger of blame can be pointed firmly at WB Interactive. Warner Brothers has patented the system until 2035, meaning no other studio can use it for over a decade.
Looks like corporate greed's back on the menu.
And number 1, Interrogations: The Punisher. Marvel might have a reputation for being a mostly fun-loving superhero franchise with bright colors and charming characters, but there's a seedy underbelly beneath the costumes and one-liners. Frank Castle, otherwise known as the Punisher, takes up at least 20% of this dark side, and his 2005 video game exemplifies that in plenty of different ways. This action-packed title puts you in the shoes of the titular vigilante as he murders his way through waves of criminals and meets meets up with popular Marvel characters. Violence is a mainstay in the game, giving you plenty of weapons to mow down your enemies with, but it goes one step further by allowing you to interrogate them in brutal fashion. And no, I'm not talking about tickle torture. This game gives you an absurd array of techniques to squeeze information out of your victims. You can take enemies to interrogation hotspots such as buzzsaws, piranha tanks, hanging knife displays, and more. After getting your information, you can even finish the job off with vulgar executions. These sequences were so brutal that the game was forced to render them in black and white to avoid an adults-only rating from the ESRB. Some games, such as Splinter Cell Conviction, have implemented similar interrogation features, but nothing has managed to ever go this far since.
When it's done right and not horrifically overpriced, video game DLC can be an absolute treat. It's a really good reason to revisit a beloved game from a new lens or with different mechanics. I used to be somebody who would put a game down once the credits rolled and moved on, not really considering dipping back in for DLC. Then I played add-ons like Mass Effect's Lair of the Shadow Broker and The Witcher 3's Hearts of Stone and realized how wrong I was. Those aren't the DLCs we're setting the spotlight on today though. Instead, we'll be looking at the DLCs that you probably overlooked for one reason or another. Maybe because of when they released, maybe the game they spawned from was unpopular, or perhaps there was a different DLC for the same game that most people gravitated to instead. Whatever the reason, we're exacting some justice today and giving these DLCs the attention they sorely deserve. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are the 10 most overlooked pieces of video game DLC. Number 10. Cold Cold Heart, Batman Arkham Origins. Now, if you haven't played these ones for yourself, you do not have to dig far into the internet to find out that the Batman Arkham games are very popular and for a very good reason. Batman Arkham Origins might not have been the most universally beloved entry, but it was solid. That said, its perception as one of the less impressive Batman Arkham games may have contributed to players missing out on some of its excellent DLC, namely the Cold Cold Heart DLC featuring none other than Mr. Freeze. The story DLC came 6 months after the release of the base game and called on players to aid the Dark Knight in his efforts to thwart Mr. Freeze's assault on Gotham City. The story, which is set a week after the events of the main game, is genuinely engrossing. Mr. Freeze's intro and backstory is cool, you'll add new equipment to Batman's arsenal, which freshens up the gameplay, and plenty of players found it was actually even more enjoyable than the main game. And yet, when the game arrived on Wii U, the planned port of the expansion was cancelled due to what they said was a lack of interest, so it's safe to say not enough people played this one. Number 9. Bad Blood, Watch Dogs. Watch Dogs had a shaky launch back in 2014 as one of the first victims of what we'll call the overhype train. People were way too excited for this, and while it delivered in a bunch of different areas, server issues and indications of graphical downgrading undermined the experience for some players. While that meant a bunch of players dropped off the game at various points, many more would have completely missed the Bad Blood DLC. The DLC released 4 months after the base game and puts you into the shoes of the eccentric hacker T-Bone instead of the original protagonist Aiden Pierce. Turns out this was a pretty good move, as it let the 10-mission long DLC take on a refreshingly lighter tone with an entertaining new protagonist. UB also added in a remote control car, which is a blast to use, and it's a wonder it didn't make it into the game proper. There are new weapons to use, plus additional perks and side missions, making this more of a good thing for those who liked Watch Dogs. Of course, given there was so much controversy over this game's launch, it's safe to say a ton of people would have missed out on this one. Number 8. Trespasser, Dragon Age Inquisition. Should Trespasser have been included in Inquisition since it's basically the super important ending that Inquisition is meant to have but only arrived as paid DLC? Sure, but it's also a pack a lot of players missed out on since it was the last to be released and you'd be forgiven for having moved on by then. Inquisition had a lot of great DLC packs, from the smaller editions like the Black Emporium that let you pick up powerful items and alter their appearance, to the Jaws of Hakon that took place on a whole new map. Trespasser takes place several years after the events of the main game, and it basically explains why Solus disappeared at the end. Without spoiling anything, it covers some really important plot points. Apart from being imperative to the future of Dragon Age, this DLC also lets you dip back into hanging out with your buds and whoever you chose to romance, so that's pretty awesome given this game is riddled with great companions. It did come out almost a full year after the base game though, so if you, like me, had moved on by then, there's a good chance you missed this one. It really does sound like we have a while to wait until Dragon Age 4 arrives though, so if you haven't dug into this one and you want to, you've got time. Number 7. Ashes of Ariandel, Dark Souls 3. We're pretty spoiled for choice when it comes to excellent Souls DLCs, but as a result, that means they can't all get the equal recognition and spotlight that they deserve. For this entry, we're highlighting Dark Souls 3's Ashes of Ariandel. It might not be as big as some of the other Souls DLC packs, but it's a meaty little add-on with some sublime encounters, which gets unfortunately overshadowed by its hot younger sister, the Ringed City DLC. Don't let that put you off though, as it's more than worth it to pick up both DLCs, especially to see some of the gorgeous boss designs and meet new story-rich characters like Sister Fried and Father Ariandel. Ashes is also the beginning of the overarching DLC story, so you'd be doing yourself a disservice to skip it in favor of tucking right into the far lengthier Ringed City. Some Souls fans are also adamant that Ashes has the best boss in Dark Souls 3, so you might not want to skip this one. Number 6. Freedom Cry, Assassin's Creed Black Flag. There are a huge handful of Assassin's Creed DLCs that could be right at home on this list, from Syndicate's Jack the Ripper DLC to the Tyranny of King Washington from AC3, and both the Hidden Ones and Curse of the Pharaohs editions for Origins. While these are all criminally underplayed, we're going to be highlighting the Freedom Cry DLC from one of the best AC games ever made, Black Flag. Releasing only a couple of months after the base game, Freedom Cry casts you as Adewale, a former slave-turned-pirate who was Black Flag protagonist Edward Kenway's right-hand man. The DLC is set 15 years after the events of the base game and was celebrated for swapping a side character into the protagonist slot, its strong narrative, exciting new weaponry, and stunning soundtrack. The top-tier AC immersion you'd expect is well and truly here, and you feel like an absolute freaking hero because, well, you are. Weirdly, not enough people seem to be talking about this DLC, so we're doing our best here to change that. Number 5. Minerva's Den, Bioshock 2. I put this one a little further up because if you like DLC, I'm betting you've already heard of Minerva's Den, but there's still loads of people who didn't play this one because it's attached to the least popular Bioshock game. Adding to the inevitable sea of players who missed this one was the fact that it was the final piece of DLC that followed some significantly less interesting offerings, and it didn't arrive until over 6 months after Bioshock 2 released. That said, if you did miss it then you really missed out because Minerva's Den is arguably one of the best DLC offerings ever made, like in video game history. It improves the combat system in really interesting ways, perfectly extends the main themes of the series in a surprising new direction, and delivers a wildly immersive narrative that you can't help but lose yourself in. The environments are as enchanting and horrifying as they've ever been, and if you're a Bioshock fan who missed this one, you absolutely must check it out. This might be one of the few DLCs so powerful that it caused players to pick it up even if they didn't really want to play Bioshock 2. But because of the fact that it's a very good DLC buried inside a less good game, we're still going to call it overlooked. Number 4. Survival, Tom Clancy's The Division. If The Division's jaw-dropping hype train moment where we watch the protagonist close a car door as they shifted across it while in cover changed your life, then you've probably played all the DLCs. If you just thought it was pretty cool, then maybe you missed out on The Division's second DLC called Survival. Survival threw you right into the frying pan with no gear and a nasty snowstorm to battle. It's a PvPvE mode where you'll basically be scrounging for clothes and equipment so you can hold your own against the environment, other agents, and hunters patrolling the game world. If that sounds pretty fun, that's because it really is. Needing to survive with limited time on the clock is a hell of a great vibe. It sort of takes everything that's good about Battle Royale modes and injects it with the tonally appropriate Division atmosphere to great effect. You can squad up with 4 players, it's wonderfully intense, and while the $15 price tag is arguably a little steep, the mechanics and challenge are so enjoyable you might find it all super worth it. It's as if The Division's full experience was poured into this little DLC pack and really distilled into its purest essence, and it works really well. If you haven't tried it or even heard of it, you might want to. Number 3. Overlord, Mass Effect 2. I wouldn't insult you by insisting you really check out the Lair of the Shadow Broker DLC because that's sufficiently rated as an excellent DLC offering. But Mass Effect does have Overlooked DLC, and one such example is Overlord. Perhaps because of the distraction of how good the Shadow Broker DLC was, Overlord may have received less attention than it deserved, but boy is it a good add-on. It explores a Cerberus research project that seems to control the Geth, and to put it lightly, this DLC goes places. The tone is legitimately creepy, you'll do a lot of planet exploring, and the dark narrative really grabs you. Not only that, but your choice at the end of the DLC will carry over into the next game, so that's pretty cool. There's also some visuals here that I really wish I could get out of my brain, but that is what it is. Number 2, The Season of Infamy, Batman Arkham Knight. We're back on Batman again, but it's for a very good reason, and that reason is, how cool are the Batman villains? Look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This one suffers from the Trespasser DLC controversy in that some players really feel like it should have been included in the main game from the jump, but given it didn't release until 6 months later, it's possible it just wasn't ready yet. The Season of Infamy DLC for Arkham Knight includes 4 missions with iconic villains: Wonderland featuring Mad Hatter, Beneath the Surface featuring Killer Croc, Shadow War featuring Ra's al Ghul, and In From the Cold featuring our old pal Mr. Freeze. Casting the spotlight on these iconic baddies is such a no-brainer, and fans love digging deeper into the villain stories and getting the opportunity to free roam the city. Each of them are so deep and engaging, they almost put the main game to shame, which does seem to be a trend on this list. Number 1, Mooncrash, Prey. I think it's fair to say that Arcane's 2017 FPS Prey is underrated and overlooked, so its fascinating Mooncrash DLC definitely qualifies. This separate game mode is a roguelike that randomizes the placement of enemies and weapons with each playthrough. You take on the role of Peter, a hacker tasked with learning how 5 people survived an attack on their moon base. He does this by taking the place of one of the survivors in a simulation. If it sounds a little confusing, it's Deathloop. This is just Deathloop before Deathloop was Deathloop. The goal is to help all 5 survivors escape within a single run, and you'll unlock them as you succeed with each escape. This DLC is brutally difficult, but in the most satisfying way. The challenge is absolutely addictive, it's gorgeously immersive, infinitely replayable, and a joy to take on. To sum it up, the gameplay takes everything that Arcane already nailed with the base game and makes it even better. There's progression to help you become more powerful from one run to the next, and classes that play quite differently. Weirdly, Bethesda barely promoted this one, and if it wasn't for a cult following that spawned from massive YouTubers shouting about just how good this game is, even fewer people would have tried their hand at it. If you still haven't checked this one out and you do enjoy Prey, it's an absolute must-play.
Right, okay, there's no beating around the bush here. The 7th generation was a rough time for Sony. While the esteemed competition, the Xbox 360 and Nintendo Wii, were basically money printers, the PS3 started slow and had to fight tooth and nail for every inch. But you know what? There were some absolute bangers on that console. However, some of them definitely didn't get the love and appreciation they deserved. So let's rectify that today and have a chat about them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 criminally overlooked PS3 games. Number 10, Legend of Heroes: Trails of Cold Steel. Now, localization can be a cruel mistress. While the process has become much more reliable nowadays, even in the age of simul-dubbing, it isn't a guaranteed thing. And just over 10 years ago, it was even worse. If you couldn't land a proper distributor in time, get ready for your game's relevance outside of your home country to be shot in the foot. And this was unfortunately the case of The Legend of Heroes: Trials of Cold Steel. Due to distributing issues, Cold Steel didn't come out in the West until way after the PS3's relevance, being one of the last franchise releases for the console. Add on to this the fact that the Trails series has always struggled over here, and what you get is a game that not a lot of people played, which is a true shame because this game rocks. If you're looking for a really fun turn-based RPG with dating sim mechanics and Fire Emblem Awakening isn't what you're in the mood for at the moment, well, you will have a lot of fun with Trials of Cold Steel. Number 9, Dragon's Crown. You would think discourse would guarantee a game would be better remembered, but sometimes the discourse can eclipse the game that helped it get going in the first place if the issue at hand is large enough, and such was the unfortunate case of Dragon's Crown. Now, Dragon's Crown, while a huge success for developer Vanillaware, got caught up in a long overdue discussion of the treatment and depiction of women in video games. Its depiction of the sorceress in particular drew ire for how blatantly sexualized the character was. Combine that with the inexorable march of time, and you get a game that people people might vaguely know about because of some controversy they remember from years back, but not much on the game itself. Now, as a game, Dragon's Crown is a fun title, combining hack and slash with multiplayer and RPG elements. The art style is gorgeous, brilliantly mixing 2D images with 2.5D environments. If you've got some cash to spare and some friends willing to throw down in some swords and sorcery fun, you can do a lot worse than Dragon's Crown. Number 8. Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. It feels like an aberration that a game with Enslaved's prestige isn't better remembered. Developed by Ninja Theory, written by the great Alex Garland, and featuring none other than Andy Serkis in a leading role. I mean, not only that, but the highly cinematic gameplay of Enslaved is very close to what has become the bread and butter of Sony's recent prestige library. And a lot of this is likely to do with the fact that Enslaved doesn't have a sequel. As vocally as some of the sectors of the internet decry the over-reliance on franchises, sequels do help titles stick in the collective minds of the gaming public, especially several generations on. Plus, there's also the fact that, true to its one-and-done nature, there's very little reason to go back to Enslaved once you've finished it. But there is something to be said about a game that does exactly what it sets out to do in one game. It makes the best case for itself that it can, and just leaves without another word. Number 7. The Saboteur. Before Call of Duty Modern Warfare, World War II was one of the quintessential settings for video games about war. But as the FPS genre moved on to the modern day, audiences just weren't looking for that anymore. World War II games had become stale and overexposed, and the audiences just didn't care. And this was likely the biggest reason why The Saboteur didn't do so hot and isn't remembered much today. Another reason is probably the fact that GTA 4 had just been released the year before, and The Saboteur is basically GTA, but you're shooting Nazis instead of cops with a bit of parkour thrown in. Still, as GTA clones go, The Saboteur is right up there with the best. GTA provides a solid gameplay template for a variety of settings, and seeing it applied to Nazi-occupied France is certainly interesting. The coolest part of this game, though, is the aesthetic, as the Nazi occupation is symbolized by a black and white filter over the city, and as you free each section of the city one by one, you literally bring color back to the City of Lights. The Saboteur is a solidly built GTA clone with a cool aesthetic that's in favor of a strong narrative hook, and if that sounds up your alley, we'll definitely give this a shot. Number 6. Singularity. Before they were turned into one of the many studios keeping Call of Duty alive, Raven Software had some big ambitions of their own. While some know them for Wolfenstein 2009 or Marvel Ultimate Alliance, we know them here for the FPS gem known as Singularity. While reviews ranked it above average, Activision was disappointed with the sales, shooting all hopes for a continuation in the foot, which is a shame seeing as how Singularity is one of the most solidly built FPS games of its day. While not on the levels of Bioshock, I mean, so few things are, Singularity swings way above its weight class and holds its own remarkably well. The guns feel weighty and responsive, and the sound design of the shots is divine, especially that shotgun. The game's central gimmick, the TMD or time manipulation device, is of course the highlight of the game, allowing the player to rapidly age up or down any object or person with the fictional element E99 in their system. Time manipulation also makes its way into the combat, with different guns having different time powers attached. And of course, this being the Bioshock age of high-concept FPS games, Singularity's story is suitably nutty with its time travel, giving you an interesting final moral choice with a third option that you may not think of your first time around. Number 5. The Simpsons game. The quality of The Simpsons may change with the weather, but when they get it right, they really get it right. While Hit and Run is the better remembered tie-in game, The Simpsons game itself deserves to be remembered just as fondly. The open-world Simpsons title sees the eponymous family realize that they're in a video game and proceed to wreak havoc in their specific brand of madness upon everything and everyone. Special powers, fun levels, and the dated late 2000 references ensue. While a lot of the humor has aged pretty poorly, remember when we all thought that the follow-up to the Xbox 360 would be the Xbox 720? Most of it holds up, and even when it doesn't, the gameplay more than picks up the slack. Each member of The Simpsons has a unique power that's utilized in both combat and platforming, and different levels pair up different members of the family to experiment with what can be done. If you get bored with the levels, then you can just wander around Springfield, grabbing collectibles and starting fistfights with the townsfolk. The Simpsons game may not be the definitive experience that such a title entails, but it is definitely a close runner-up. Number 4. Nier.
It's tragic that the 7th gen was when anti-JRPG sentiment was at its peak over here in the West, because this era produced some truly great examples of the genre, and one of them was Yoko Taro's Nier. Nier, in the same vein as its much more successful younger sibling, Nier Automata, Potato Patata, yes it's back, is a hack-and-slash RPG set in the long-running Drakengard universe. And also like Automata, don't worry, you don't need to know a damn thing about any of the other games to enjoy Nier. All you need to know is that there's a cool white-haired anime guy with a big sword and he's going to kill a lot of people. I mean, that's all you ever really need to know in most scenarios, really. In all seriousness, though, this story is amazing, as tends to be the case for Yoko Taro narratives. The gameplay and frame rate are also heavily improved from the Drakengard games, but then any frame rate is better than those slideshows. The combat is snappy, responsive, and incredibly satisfying, and the atmosphere of this world is sublime. While lack of advertising and a Western market that was incredibly hostile to anything too Japanese at the time cost it the widespread success it deserved. But 2010's loss can be your gain, especially if you love to hear Laura Bailey swearing like a sailor. Number 3, Vanquish. Platinum Games has garnered a well-deserved reputation for being one of the most consistently fun game studios in the business, and most people know them for Nier Automata and Bayonetta, but another of their games from this era goes criminally overlooked, and that is Vanquish. And to be honest, it's not hard to see why this is, although it is just ridiculous. It's such a fun game. Platinum apparently thought that this game was so good that it could only go head-to-head with Black Ops on opening weekend. Needless to say, it got its butt handed to it. Playing it these days, however, will quickly yield the reasons why it received the rave reviews that it did from those few that reviewed it upon launch. Vanquish is the perfect love child of Gears of War and Metal Gear Rising, a blindingly fast-paced third-person shooter that rewards the player for blasting their way through enemies as fast as possible. Vanquish is viscerally fun in ways that it seems that only Platinum Games have been interested in giving people, at least in the AAA gaming sphere. Sure, the characters aren't the most interesting, and the most memorable bit of the story is the infuriating cliffhanger that it ends on, but that's not why you play Vanquish. You play Vanquish to murder as many Russian-styled robots as fast as possible and look damn good whilst doing it. And number 1, Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. You know you're destined to remain a cult classic when you have exactly enough hype to generate interest for a remaster, but not enough to energize interest for more. This is the sad but also kind of weird fate of Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. Much like Vanquish, the expectations for this game's success right out of the gate were simply too high for a brand new IP. This was compounded by the fact that at first blush, there wasn't anything to set it apart from other fantasy game franchises out there. Compare this to 2008's Dragon Age Origins, which put the witty character writing and dark, broody tone front and center in every advertisement that it had. The appeal of Kingdoms of Amalur only makes itself apparent once you're waist deep into the actual game. The best thing about Amalur is the gameplay and its world building. You control an adventurer who should by all rights be dead, but isn't. And with that cosmic accident comes the ability to break fate, helping the otherwise helpless and saving the otherwise doomed. Gameplay is a remarkably deep spin on an RPG hack-and-slash formula. Not the most complex thing in the world, but enough to get you hooked. Kingdoms of Amalur was unfairly overlooked in its heyday, but the good news is that this new remastered edition means that can be corrected.
While it's been a divisive little year, 2023 has arguably offered up some of the better video game experiences we've seen in recent years, at least within a 12-month period. But it's also fair to say the developers of this year's most overlooked games might not agree, because as great as rave reviews are, they also need the sales data to back it up. Now, while we certainly can't confirm how most of these games have sold, and some handily are available on Xbox Game Pass, it's clear that none of them have made quite the tectonic impact with players they absolutely should have. From card-carrying indies to an egregiously slapped-on AAA masterpiece, you can't go wrong with any of these unsung games in the last 12 or so months. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are the 10 most overlooked video games of 2023. Number 10, Viewfinder. Let's kick things off with one of the most ingeniously premised video games ever. The brain-breakingly brilliant puzzler Viewfinder gives players a camera and allows them to take Polaroid photographs of the environment, which can then be placed in the very same 3D space, creating pathways towards the teleport pod in each level. If the influence from Valve's Portal is obvious, Viewfinder is nevertheless a challenging and innovative puzzle game all of its own, forcing the player to consider perspective and scale in order to progress to the next stage. As with any great puzzler, it also keeps finding clever ways to up the ante, forcing you to jump through a whole bunch of hoops and mental gymnastics to make sure you can keep up with it all the way to the creative end. Though those craving a nuanced story should certainly look elsewhere, Viewfinder's first-rate mechanics are so brilliantly befuddling, you'll surely not care about the threadbare narrative. Number 9. Cocoon. Viewfinder is far from the only mind-bendingly impressive puzzle game to be released this year. There's also the mesmerizing Cocoon. The brainchild of director Jeb Carlson, the lead gameplay designer of indie masterworks Limbo and Inside, Cocoon pits players as a beetle-like insect as they traverse a barren wasteland and harness unique abilities using a series of orbs. Cocoon's primary mechanic involves swapping between the game's numerous colored orbs in order to visit its various hub-like worlds and keep progressing onwards. As the use case of each orb becomes more complex, players will find themselves nesting orbs within orbs in order to solve increasingly tricky puzzles, making for a supremely challenging but also tremendously rewarding experience. In addition to this, the atmosphere, wrought through an incredible soundtrack and some really intriguing visuals, is richer than almost anything else released this year. If you're in the market for a puzzler that's smart but not infuriatingly difficult, Cocoon is just the ticket. Number 8. Killer Frequency. Fans of 80s slasher flicks are basically duty-bound to play Killer Frequency, a horror-adventure game in which players control a former celebrity DJ who's forced to become his sleepy town's emergency dispatcher when a serial killer, the Whistling Man, begins stalking the locals. Despite the genre it technically belongs to, Killer Frequency isn't a particularly challenging or stressful game. That's given you spend the overwhelming majority of it manning a DJ booth while the mayhem unfolds outside, and even the periodic puzzles aren't particularly noodle-baking. But this loving neon-soaked pastiche is absolutely dripping with atmosphere from first minute to last, aided hugely by the outstanding voice acting from the ensemble cast. Expertly balancing genuine suspense with a bunch of wry humor, this game is an absolute must-play if you love a horror B-movie. And even if not, it's a damn creative, gorgeous ride all the same. Number 7. Planet of Lana. Fans of Abe's Odyssey are doing themselves a huge disservice if they sleep on Planet of Lana any longer. An exceptional sci-fi puzzler in which players control the titular teenage girl and her cat Mui as they traverse a planet invaded by malevolent alien machines. Breathtakingly cinematic by way of its first-rate art direction and wonderfully minimalist story, Wishfully Studios' game takes a familiar premise and makes it uncommonly memorable, courtesy of its singular aesthetics and easygoing gameplay. Despite the peril of its concept, there's no combat to speak of and only minimal stealth sections that you should get through with ease, so the focus here is definitely on puzzle solving and exploration. Though well reviewed by most outlets and rocking a very positive rating on Steam, there's been curiously little sustained chatter about this one since it launched in May, and it bafflingly nabbed not even a single nomination at the Game Awards. In a year overflowing with admittedly fantastic AAA experiences, but those that demand dozens if not hundreds of hours from you, this particular little gem is absolutely an oasis in the desert. Number 6. Venba. No single game on this list is nearly as chilled out as Venba, a delightful narrative-driven cooking sim of sorts, surely doing for South Indian cuisine what the Coffee Talk games did for caffeine. The game follows an Indian couple who moved to Toronto, Canada to start a new life. It chronicles their difficulties in adjusting to their new environment and the challenges it poses for themselves and their relationship. But at its heart, Venba is centered entirely around food, as players are tasked with cooking a variety of mouth-watering dishes, all while being deeply immersed in Tamil culture throughout. Bolstered by an eye-popping art style, heart-soaring musical score, and genuinely life-affirming joie de vivre, this is the rarest of games that'll actually make you want to get up, put the games away, and cook something for real. At just 90 minutes in length, this one is an incredibly slight, snappy experience, but one that will absolutely leave a deep impression on you. Number 5. Oxenfree 2: Lust Signals. You'd be forgiven for failing to realize that a sequel to Night School Studios' cult classic mystery adventure game Oxenfree even came out this year, so head-scratchingly low profile was its release this past summer. But don't be fooled, Oxenfree 2 is another fantastic plunge into a David Lynch-style surreal experience, and if you did miss the first one, this one actually works as a standalone experience. Players control 30-something Riley after she returns to her hometown for a job, where her investigations into a series of strange radio anomalies in the area lead her on a wildly bewildering journey.
Oxenfree 2 combines a thick sense of uneasy mood with winning banter between its two central characters, Riley and her co-worker Jacob, and a short but sweet narrative packed with unexpected twists and turns. Oxenfree 2 is a real treat for adventurous players, especially if you're happy with a game that doesn't leave you with everything spelled out, and even though it doesn't explain it, it certainly makes you feel it. Number 4, Alan Wake 2. It seems absurd to call a game as hugely hyped, rewarded, and rapturously received as Alan Wake 2 overlooked. But considering its launch window sales weren't exactly stellar, and it's already been heavily discounted less than a month after release, it's clear that not nearly enough people have played it yet. Granted, the long-awaited survival horror sequel absolutely did come out in a very crowded AAA corridor for games, but it's absolutely one of the boldest, most creative, and exciting games in the space that we've seen in a long time. If there were somehow any lingering doubts about Remedy's ability to deliver some of the most meticulously crafted epic entertainment in the gaming sphere, Alan Wake 2's entrancing story, near peerless aesthetics, and ambitious attempts to move the medium forward prove it in spades. There are moments in this thing like nothing you've ever seen in a game before, but saying anything more than that would be criminal. For anyone in the market for a deep dish mystery thriller girded by incredible production values and relentless imagination, look no further. Number 3, Bomb Rush Cyberpunk. It's incredibly easy to take one look at Bomb Rush Cyberpunk and dismiss its aesthetic and skate-based gameplay as shamelessly imitating Dreamcast cult classic Jet Set Radio. Yet given the quality of the end product and the fact that nothing substantial has been done with the Jet Set Radio IP in over 20 years now, it's also easy to view this quite charitably as a glorious spiritual successor. Much like its inspiration, you and your gang skate around a futuristic metropolis, this time around New Amsterdam instead of Tokyo. Here you'll be spraying graffiti, controlling turf, taking on rival groups, and skirting clear of the cops. As won't surprise anyone who's played Jet Set Radio, the cel-shaded art style is sublime to behold while rocking a swish indie soundtrack, including contributions from Jet Set Radio's own original composer, Hideki Naganuma. Where the line between homage and ripoff lies will ultimately be for players to decide for themselves. Regardless, this one brings an absolute classic into the modern era with flawless style and energetic panache. Number 2, Jusant. If you're craving an uber-relaxing puzzle platformer to cleanse the palate amid the avalanche of AAA epics released this year, you couldn't do much better than Jusant. The latest offering from Life is Strange devs Don't Nod, Jusant is a traversal-focused adventure game where you play as a lone wanderer attempting to climb a gigantic tower. Refreshingly, the game has no combat to speak of and is focused almost entirely on players ascending the tower, with the game's intuitive tactile climbing mechanics turning the seemingly simple mission into an addictive puzzle in its own right. Rather than bog players down with reams of exposition, Jusant is a pleasingly minimalist experience that actually has no dialogue at all. Instead, you're encouraged to learn about the world by just exploring it. With its low level of difficulty and emphasis on giving players a visually stunning meditative experience, aided by a gorgeous musical score from, and excuse my pronunciation, Guillaume Farran, Jusant is the sort of transcendent title we desperately need more of. Number 1, The Invincible. One of the most visionary games of the entire year, The Invincible can't be easily dismissed as yet another walking simulator, given its jaw-droppingly rich atmosphere and prestigious source material. Stanislaw Lem's 1964 hard sci-fi novel of the same name. You'll spend most of the game's 5-hour playtime walking around the hostile planet Regis 3 as astrobiologist protagonist Yasna as you search for your missing crewmates. That said, developer Starwood Industries invest so deeply in their characters and game world that it's hard not to become intoxicated. While you could reductively call it Firewatch in space given the sparseness of its setting and the player's minimal direct interactions with other characters, The Invincible is still very much a haunting gem all on its own merits. Sadly, despite rock-solid critical reviews and a very positive Steam user rating from those who actually bought it, the game's launch window sales have been incredibly soft to date, suggesting a walking sim not on Xbox Game Pass releasing in such a crowded year didn't have much of a chance to break out. One can only hope that a game this good will find its audience in the coming months when there's a slightly less busier slate on the horizon.
2024 has been an absolutely packed year for video games, and if you're anything like me, between the likes of Tekken 8 and Final Fantasy and Dragon's Dogma and everything else, you might have seen a few titles slip through the cracks. And yeah, I know your backlog is absolutely massive, but you don't want to end the year not having checked out the following games. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 most overlooked video games of 2024 so far. Number 10, Open Roads. Look, I'm still in denial, like you probably are, that we are well into the 2000s being the focal point of the nostalgia cycle. But I shouldn't be surprised that we're starting to see video games mine this period for interesting characters and emotional dynamics. Open Roads is the latest naughty set drama, a story-driven adventure game about a mother and daughter grieving the loss of the family's complicated matriarch. Between a mix of first-person exploration and charming visual novel-esque cutscenes, Open Roads is a short but incredibly emotional game. With stellar performances from Caitlin Dever, who is currently set to play the live-action version of Abby in The Last of Us Season 2, by the way, and Kerry Russell, it may not live up to the quality of the developer's previous work, including the seminal Gone Home, but it is a worthy addition to their oeuvre. Especially if you own Game Pass, it's definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of story-driven games. Number 9, Pacific Drive. Pacific Drive is unlike any other game released so far this year. Sure, you can look at its disparate parts and see that it's made up of survival elements here and horror elements there, with a slathering of roguelike glue holding everything together, but much like the cars that you'll be building in the game itself, the overall result is much more than the sum of its parts. Set in The Zone, a section of the Pacific Northwest that's been sealed off from the rest of the country due to the unexplainable phenomena and extreme weather that dominates the area, your goal is to drive into the dangerous wilds and fill up your car with loot to bring back to home base. With each run, you'll find bits and bobs that'll allow you to upgrade your car, eventually crafting stronger components that'll withstand runs into deeper, more dangerous areas, in the hopes of uncovering the mystery at the heart of what the hell happened to this part of the country. Although there's no combat to speak of, Pacific Drive is just as intense as any shooter on the market. The risk-reward gameplay sees you spending longer in the zone in the hopes of grabbing better loot, but the longer you're out there, the more banged up your car's gonna get, and you might end up losing everything that you grabbed along the way. This is a game where spending time creating the most durable vehicle and packing just the right amount of equipment for the mission is as thrilling as actually being in the thick of it. Number 8, Rise of the Ronin. For a while, it didn't seem as though Rise of the Ronin was destined to be overlooked or undervalued. The latest open-world Souls-like from Team Ninja received a huge marketing push from Sony and launched as one of the first major PS5 releases this year. However, enthusiasm for the game died down in the run-up to launch thanks to some lukewarm reviews and trailers that had people deriding the exclusive for looking like a PS3 game. Their words, not mine. And sure, it's not a 10 out of 10 smash by any means, and its graphics can't hold a candle to the most lavish of first-party blockbusters. But Rise of the Ronin is still a thoroughly recommendable game. Essentially a mix between Elden Ring and Ghost of Tsushima, Team Ninja's latest is the devs' most ambitious game yet. An 80-hour epic overflowing with dungeons to explore, side missions to take on, and enemy bounties to cash in. Though its open world is structured like most in the genre, dotted with activities broken up by progressing the main story, it's all kept fresh by the outstanding combat system at the game's core. This is the most immediate a Team Ninja game has felt since Ninja Gaiden, taking a leaf out of Star Wars Jedi Survivor's playbook by splitting the difference between Souls-style challenge and DMC-style power fantasy. The devs get the balance just right, crafting a tough but fair gameplay loop that's both varied and rewarding enough to sustain the lengthy runtime. The story is maybe a little bit too ambitious for its own good, but this is mechanically anyway one of the best games you can play this year. Number 7, Cannibal Abduction. Oh look, it's a Josh list and he's banging on again about Puppet Combo. Come on man, change the frickin' record. I know you're all probably saying that, but hey, what can I say? When Puppet Combo stop making and publishing great games on the regular, I'll stop talking about them. Under the torture style label, the publisher has brought a bunch of amazing horror experiences to console recently, including early release Cannibal Abduction. Now this is a short but sweet third-person survival horror game about a guy, you, trapped in a house with a murderous cannibal. Presented with PS1/early PS2 style retro graphics, you're tasked with exploring the killer's abode while solving puzzles and keeping away from the end of the maniac's knife. This is a shorter experience, admittedly, made to be mostly played in a single sitting in lieu of whacking on a horror film, but that's to the game's benefit. It's charming, rough around the edges, but filled with enough gory delights to leave a great lasting impression. And even better, this is bundled as well with The Night of the Scissors, an even shorter but just as impactful title that works with the same basic gameplay principles. As a package, they're well worth the price for anyone who misses the glory days of non-blockbuster survival horror games like Obscure. If you played that, what can I say? You're a real one. Number 6. Crow Country. There have been a bunch of great horror throwback games flying under the radar across the past few years. Hell, I just talked to you about 2 in the last entry. Signalis, though, was easily one of the best, molded in the classic survival horror style of the PS1 years. And 2024 saw the release of the similarly designed Crow Country, with character models looking like the polygonal, blocky nightmares found in something like Final Fantasy VII, and low-res environments funneling you into the path of locked doors and theme park monstrosities. There is more going on under the hood here than a simple nostalgia play. The general framing has you investigating a mysterious theme park hiding a sinister secret, with each of the themed wings and attractions transforming from cuddly entertainment for the kids into sinister enemies out for your blood. It's a premise that could have felt a little bit one-note or overly quirky admittedly, but Crow Country finds the balance between camp and horror, approaching the subject matter with enough self-awareness without sacrificing a genuinely spooky atmosphere. There are a few nice twists on the expected mechanics as well. The ability to move the camera with the right stick awards the player's curiosity and frees them from the confines of a truly static camera. Manual aiming and damage values award the combat with surprising depth, while the puzzles similarly add extra wrinkles to the classic key searching formula. All told, it's a must-play for horror fanatics. Number 5, Still Wakes the Deep. Look, I didn't expect to have 3 horror games in a row on here, but that's just sometimes how it shakes out. Still Wakes the Deep is a nightmarish cross between The Thing and Cold Fear, with a little bit of Soma thrown in for good measure. A first-person horror title from the Chinese Room, this 1970s set period piece casts you as Kaz, an electrician stationed on a rickety oil rig. Between running from his demons back on the mainland to dealing with union-busting bosses and out-and-out proud racists in his own team, the character's life gets a whole lot worse when the rig's drill hits something unexpected in the sea. Though we've seen plenty of story-driven, first-person horror games with light stealth mechanics like Still Wakes the Deep in the past, few have been presented with as much confidence or polish. From the stunning photorealistic graphical style to the small authentic details housed in the rig itself, the Chinese Room's latest is a masterclass in atmosphere and world building. Though there is plenty of gore and body horror thrills, this is a mature horror game for more than just the blood and guts. Kaz's personal tale provides a grounded dramatic tether that metaphorically reflects the more conventional horror of the most bombastic set pieces in a way best left unspoiled, but trust me, is ripe for interpretation. It's definitely closer to a walking simulator than a true stealth game, but if you enjoyed the likes of Amnesia: The Dark Descent and the aforementioned Soma, you'll be right at home here. Number 4, Indica. Hellblade 2 was a little bit of a disappointment, wasn't it? Well, fortunately for us, it wasn't the only third-person narrative-driven action game that we received in the first half of 2024. And hell, even if Hellblade 2 was a smash, Indica would have still given it a run for its money. A wholly original adventure title about a nun named Indica who is sent to deliver a letter across a dangerous and surreal alternate history take on Russia. This is a game impossible to sum up in just a few hundred words. It's utterly unpredictable at every step, in one moment offering deep meditations on faith and religion, and the next taking a turn into fable-style fairy tale logic where slapstick and dark humor reign supreme. Though you can boil the game down to walking, platforming, and solving physics puzzles, Indica has such an authorial stamp that it presents these tried and tested mechanics in interesting ways. From making praying itself part of the gameplay to changing entire genres to present you with pixel art powered 2D sequences, this is an experience that tries everything it can think of and mostly nails the execution. Number 3, Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. Ubisoft has needed a win for a decade now. After spending most of the last generation pumping out generic sequels to their biggest franchises and attempting to launch botched live service games, the troubled company has made some positive moves over the last few months. Though mostly sticking to the in-house AAA formula, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora was much better than most expected, while this year's Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown was a bona fide smash. Returning the franchise to its side-scrolling origins, the latest installment is a stunningly tight 2.5D Metroidvania action game. With impressive level design and surprisingly satisfying and visually spectacular combat, The Lost Crown came out of nowhere to become one of 2024's first Game of the Year contenders. Hopefully, the company learns from this critical success and learns a valuable lesson. Not every revival of a beloved franchise has to be a live service cash grab. Number 2, System Shock. System Shock is one of the most respected sci-fi gaming franchises of all time, but when most people talk about, they're usually discussing the more popular sequel. As such, the original iteration, with its simpler Metroidvania structure and lower emphasis on RPG systems, falls by the wayside. Thankfully, a recent faithful remake finally hit consoles in 2024 after a PC launch last year, gloriously updating the original 90s PC cyberpunk aesthetic into a mix of old meets new retro textures and tile sets. The devs have tried to create an updated version of the game that looks like your brain remembers it, rather than radically overhaul what was there with a new style. In practice, that makes for striking visuals, with the fine details of the space station you're shooting your way through brought to life with care and attention. Gameplay-wise, it's your classic Metroidvania structure. You move from one level to the next across an interconnected space station, roam the labyrinthine corridors, and mentally note down locked doors that you'll be returning to later. It's an engrossing loop for sure, one made more satisfying to engage with thanks to responsive controls and a drip feed of intriguing environmental storytelling. That story itself might not feel all that groundbreaking all these decades later, but it still makes for a tense, scary sci-fi shooter trip. Number 1, Nobody Wants to Die. Nobody Wants to Die is a tragically undermarketed cyberpunk detective game that throws you into a world where, as the title teases, society has progressed to the point where the wealthier folks can literally buy their way to a life of immortality. And truthfully, I kind of feel like I could just end the entry there, what with that premise alone being so tantalizing. But Nobody Wants to Die backs up its interesting on-paper ideas with a lush, fully realized sci-fi world. If Cyberpunk's Night City was merged with BioShock's Rapture, developers Critical Hit Games commits to its retro-futurist framing, encouraging players to mix old-fashioned detective work with science fiction gadgets and abilities. Manipulating time to find clues and piece together crime scenes, the gameplay might not be the deepest, but it has enough flair to maintain interest for the title's shorter duration. And it's all in service of a rabbit hole story that cuts into the marrow of a darkly disturbing city. This thing came out of nowhere, but with inventive puzzle mechanics and a hugely memorable setting, it's sure to make an impact on anyone who gives it a chance.
Now, it goes without saying that there are simply more great games out there than anyone has time to play, and so our attention typically turns to those titles that are heavily marketed by publishers with an established track record of quality. But even the biggest and most successful publishers in the business have allowed ultimately great games to fall through the cracks, where to this day they remained overlooked cult faves. So let's take a look at them today, as I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 overlooked video games by great publishers. Number 10, The Warriors, Rockstar. Now, Rockstar Games definitely has one of the most enviable back catalogues in the entire games industry, between Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead, Bully, LA Noire, Manhunt, Max Payne, and Midnight Bloody Club. But back in 2005, Rockstar did the rarest of things. They released a video game based on a movie that was actually great. The Warriors, adapted from Walter Hill's hit 1979 action thriller of the same name, both translated the film into a beat-em-up format and expanded its narrative to deliver a fleshed-out prequel to the movie's story. Far from the typicality of video games listlessly, awkwardly translating entire movies into video game form, The Warriors impressively captured the grimy style and tone of 70s New York City whilst offering up unexpectedly deep and satisfying combat. The brawls in this game are ludicrously chaotic and fun, and while not nearly as expansive as Rockstar's GTA games, it proved what could be achieved when developers actually cared about the material that they were adapting. Bizarrely, The Warriors has rather been lost in the shuffle amid Rockstar's output though. Number 9. Power Stone. Capcom. Now, Capcom has a bevy of hit franchises to their name, such as Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, Street Fighter, Mega Man, sometimes when they remember it exists, and, of course, Devil May Cry. But there is also one that never gets its fair due, and that is Power Stone. Released in 1999 for the Dreamcast, this multiplayer fighting game was basically the console's answer to Super Smash Bros., an absurdly enjoyable party brawler that benefited from its simple control scheme and the genius hook of players collecting the titular gems in order to unleash the full extent of their powers. 2000's sequel Power Stone 2 was even better, beefing up the multiplayer from 2 players to 4, but in the near quarter century since their release, both games have largely been forgotten by all but the most die-hard of fans. The games were ported to the PSP back in 2006, but feel long overdue for a port to modern systems with online functionality, if not a full-on remake or even an outright sequel. In Capcom's pantheon of banger properties, Power Stone deserves so much more respect. Number 8. Vagrant Story. Square Enix. Square Enix is of course fondly remembered for publishing hit RPG franchises like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Star Ocean, and Kingdom Hearts, but it is about damn time that players finally give Vagrant Story its due. Released for the PlayStation in February of 2000, Vagrant Story offered a very different RPG experience compared to that of Final Fantasy games, relying more on environmental storytelling and touting a much less forgiving difficulty level, and also placing a greater emphasis on exploration. All this, combined with the more complex combat system and lack of towns, shops, and NPCs, likely contributed to the game failing to make the same commercial splash as Square's established RPG franchises. But on its own terms, it felt massively ahead of its time upon release, pushing the PS1 hardware to near breaking point. You barely know it though, given how little Square Enix had done to celebrate the game over the last 2+ decades. Fans have passionately called again and again to the publisher to remake or at least remaster Vagrant Story, but considering that it didn't make a huge commercial wave, being overshadowed by the likes of Final Fantasy 8 and 9, we really shouldn't hold our breath. Number 7. Pyre. Supergiant Games. Supergiant Games is one of the most impressively consistent publishers that releases games today, and since 2011, each of their 4 releases has garnered major acclaim. And while there's a good chance that you've played Bastion and Transistor, and a very good chance that you've at least played their most recent game Hades, there's another title released between these 3 that didn't really amass nearly the amount of fanfare that its quality indicated. Pyre was released in 2017 and did something truly unique with the typical action RPG formula, centering gameplay not around hacking and slashing, but instead rights, a series of rugby-like team-based encounters that immediately separated the game from its brethren. While Pyre received glowing reviews upon release, its sales reportedly fell far short of both Bastion and Transistor. Perhaps the unconventional nature of its gameplay that led to some to label it as a sports game turned players off en masse, but whatever the reason, it's a game that deserves a far greater cult of fans than it's ever had. Even with Supergiant's general popularity, Pyre has more or less faded into the periphery, overshadowed by the phenomenal success of Hades. Number 6. Déraciné. From Software. Now, there's no denying that From Software are best known for their tricky action RPGs like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, Elden Ring, and also the Armored Core franchise. But in 2017, sandwiched between the releases of Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, the publisher quietly dropped an unassuming first-person adventure game which paid homage to their cult classic 1998 game Echo Knight. Déraciné, an existential mystery title for the PSVR, sees players wandering the halls of a boarding school as a fairy, and while admittedly lacking the technical finesse of From Software's AAA offerings, turned out to be a highly affecting and engrossing effort. As an exercise in atmosphere and emotional environmental storytelling, it's a hugely unsung treat, yet even accepting the audience-limiting nature of its PSVR exclusive release, this thing kind of came and went with a blip. So if you've got Sony's VR headset and can drag yourself away from Elden Ring for a hot minute, Da Racine is more than deserving of 5 hours of your time. Number 5. Dreams, Sony. Media Molecules Dreams was published by Sony in 2020, and though the game creation hub received universal acclaim for the depth of its creation suite, it sadly never broke out to become a wider mainstream hit. Dreams was ultimately lost in the shuffle amongst Sony's war chest of AAA blockbuster titles, no matter that it offered up a totally unique gameplay experience and jaw-dropping array of tools for players to make their own art, with VR support no less. Shortly after its full release, the hype surrounding the game died down considerably as more casual users moved on to other games and only the hardcore community remained. Despite the relative accessibility of its creation tools, Dreams is all but forgotten in mainstream gaming discourse less than 3 years after its release, which given the ingenuity of its systems is a damn shame. There are reasonable arguments to be made that Sony should have released Dreams as a free-to-play title and also put it on other platforms, but given the PS4's massive install base at the time of its release, it's rather depressing that it didn't move the needle more. Number 4. Transformers: Fall of Cybertron, Activision. Now, it's absolutely reasonable to be skeptical about any Transformers game given that many shoddy titles based on the beloved IP have been released, but 2012's Transformers: Fall of Cybertron, a sequel to the surprisingly good Transformers: War for Cybertron, was such a breath of fresh air. Activision, best known for publishing the Call of Duty franchise, released the game to a bafflingly muted wave of fanfare considering how much bloody fun it was to play. Beyond the thrilling gameplay, it also touted a surprisingly engaging story and benefited from voice actors Peter Cullen and Greg Berger reprising their voice roles from the animated series as Optimus Prime and Grimlock respectively. It didn't help at all that Activision's rush to market follow-up, the spin-off title Transformers: Rise of the Dark Spark, was panned by most critics, in turn poisoning the well and bringing the series to an end. And with Activision delisting the game from digital storefronts in 2017 due to their licensing agreement with Hasbro expiring, it's actually tough to find a well-priced legal version of Fall of Cybertron these days. But considering the clear love and effort that developer High Moon Studios put into it, it deserves far better than to basically just become lost to time. Number 3. Prey, Bethesda Softworks. Now, Bethesda is one of those undeniable publishing giants of the modern gaming industry, with Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, Doom, and Wolfenstein among their most iconic AAA franchises. But in 2017, they hoped to launch a new IP with the trippy sci-fi FPS Prey, a delirious, beautifully designed genre-bending title that received rave reviews from many major outlets. But despite this, Prey was a massive commercial disappointment, a fact attributed to numerous factors: Bethesda's baffling decision to barely market the game, the difficulty of selling Sims to mainstream audiences, and the publisher withholding review copies until the release date. It also didn't help that naming the game Prey suggested that it was linked to 2006's FPS of the same name, creating market confusion and leaving some players unsure if they needed to play the first game. All in all, Prey is one of the most creative FPSs of its generation, yet it barely made a dent compared to Bethesda's flagship titles. Number 2. Sayonara Wild Hearts, Annapurna Interactive. Now, Annapurna's Interactive's name may not carry the immediately identifiable weight of, say, Rockstar or Square Enix, but over the last 5 years, they've cornered the market on delivering an enticing slate of left-field titles focusing on unconventional gameplay and emotional storytelling. Some of their biggest hits include the likes of What Remains of Edith Finch, Flower, Gone Home, Outer Wilds, Telling Lies, Kentucky Route Zero, and most recently, Stray. But one fantastic game that's sadly been lost in the shuffle is Sayonara Wild Hearts, a gorgeous rhythm actioner released in 2019 to strong acclaim, which, while extremely short and mechanically very simple, is one of the most visually stunning games of any kind released this past decade. Though wildly lauded by critics and nominated for 3 Game Awards, it didn't make much of an impact in the wider gaming sphere, and sadly hasn't amassed the same following of their other prominent releases. Seriously, if you haven't played Sayonara Wild Hearts yet, go pick it up now, as it's just a couple of bucks. And number 1, Shadow of Memories, Konami. Though Konami has shifted away from console games towards the lucrative mobile gaming market in recent years, there's no arguing with their iconic status in the industry, having published the likes of Metal Gear, Silent Hill, Castlevania, Contras, and Pro Evolution Soccer. But a few months before they released the incredible Silent Hill 2, Konami quietly dropped a similarly engrossing mystery romp that is scarcely talked about today, and that is Shadow of Memories, or if you're American, Shadow of Destiny. Shadow of Memories sees our protagonist travel through time in an attempt to solve and even prevent his own murder. The player's actions in the past reverberate through the timeline, affecting subsequent gameplay, but as ingenious a hook as this was, the game's lack of combat likely prevented it from becoming a major sales success. As a result, Shadow of Memories quickly evaporated into the pop culture ether, and even with subsequent releases on Xbox, PC, and PSP, it is barely talked about almost 25 years later beyond the occasional retrospective article. Given its staggering level of ambition and creativity, it clearly deserves better. So, remake when?
No matter which of the two bigger systems you own, there are a ton of phenomenal titles to pick up. Oh, and Nintendo Switch owners, we'll get to you guys in good time. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 overlooked PS4 and Xbox One games you need to stop ignoring. Number 10, Kingdom Come: Deliverance. Unfortunately and annoyingly caught in a tailspin conversation surrounding the game's depiction of race in 1400s Bohemia, I'm gonna sidestep that entirely for the sake of recommending Kingdom Come as one of the most refreshingly back-to-basics survivalist RPGs in quite some time. Foregoing the majority of hand-holding quest design tropes or labyrinthine tutorials for a mindset that casts you as no-namer Henry, you're then sent off on a revenge mission with everything from sword fighting to poison resistance being earned along the way. You'll start out getting battered in fights, have your health whittled down to 0 in seconds by cack-handed duels, and barely scrape by in any social space because no one really knows who you are. Some fantastically delivered cutscenes segment the idea that all of this is intentional though, as you're supposed to go on a rags-to-riches journey alongside Henry, learning as he does how to fire a bow, how to take on multiple attackers, and how to craft healing bombs with ease. The result is like nothing else, an endlessly rewarding experience that plays on certain fantasy RPG ideals but wraps them in a ton of real-world history. At least I'm pretty sure it does. Number 9, Nioh. Literally the next best thing to the original Dark Souls if we're talking about games that took major influence from that game. Nioh's combat is fast, brutal, tactile, and accomplished. You'll likely know the standard Souls formula of turtling around enemies and picking your spots, but Nioh adds a rewarding loot system marked on the map by other fallen players. Defeat them and you'll earn sizable rewards, actually encouraging grinding to overcome the next set-piece battle if you happen to get stuck. Also in here are customizable attack and defense animations, multiple stances per weapon, and a game engine that encourages speed and confidence once you get your head around everything. It's sublime and a worthy successor to Ninja Gaiden. Number 8, Gang Beasts. The best local multiplayer game of the generation, easily. Gang Beasts almost doubles as the best wrestling game ever as well, as its freeform Havoc physics animation system sees bodies flop and flail around after being thrown or slammed. Overall though, it's the idea of a set-piece brawler that makes everything pop. Punches, choke slams, two-armed lifts, high-flying clotheslines, and devastating dropkicks, it's all done through a control scheme that animates your arms, legs, and head respectively. Once you've got it down, you and your friends will be climbing the walls for leaps of faith or trading blows while hanging onto the side of a moving Ferris wheel. Experimentation is key, but the possibilities that developers Bone Loaf have programmed in, phenomenal name, are all worth seeking out. Number 7, The Evil Within 1 and 2. The current horror landscape is enamored with first-person perspectives and in-your-eyes jump scares. But to be honest, Resident Evil 4 was onto something timeless with its over-shoulder camera and more action-based setup. The Evil Within, then, is director Shinji Mikami's first shot at horror since then, and the game's chainsaw-wielding goons and miscaked villages are emblematic of it being a spiritual successor. From here, though, the idea of a Matrix-style, everybody's connected to a shared dreamscape of nightmares and memories setup allows for the craziest creatures Mikami and his team have ever devised. They all end up being great fun to bring down with a shotgun that kicks like a cage fighter, but it's the sequel that kind of redefines horror design as we know it, taking an open world design template and making gaming's first open world horror, though it only happens in 2 specific spots. Having jump scares, secrets, and set pieces spread across a world of stealth and contemplation makes for one hell of a change of pace. Come for the old school controls and creature feature enemies, but stay for the playful expansion of what horror can do as a genre. Number 6, ReCore Definitive Edition. Now look, it may not have been the smoothest of games to this day. ReCore was developed alongside Mighty No. 9, which, is an abomination, but this re-released Definitive Edition did more than just touch up the base game. To be frank, it finished it. Entire chunks of the once terrible endgame were completed, with ReCore now able to shine as something that does away with precision aiming for a lock-on shooter, specializing in movement, ammo types, and finishes. Almost making you apply a melee sensibility to third-person shooting, the challenges in juggling enemies and looking for openings. A tactile sensibility that extends to an array of customizable companions you'll get to flesh out with myriad parts and XP. Also worth noting is that the script is from Halo 1, 2, and 3 writer Joseph Staten, a quasi-post-apocalyptic tale where leading Lady Jewel arrives too late to an ongoing scientific expedition, leaving her to find out what's been happening in the interim years. Just don't let its stop-start launch put you off. ReCore has a ton to offer, and despite everything, its heart is in the right place. Number 5, Minute. Now, I know you're gonna say, well, that looks like something I'd play on a piece of ham. And you may be right, but it doesn't make Minute any less charming or superbly designed. Set around a lone hero finding a sword that then traps them to a never-ending loop of 1 minute lifetimes, Minute is like the original Zelda done bite-sized, with a Groundhog Day premise resetting when the clock strikes 0. While you might think this makes gameplay incredibly limiting, quickly you discover how immaculately well-planned every facet of the game is. Instead of time being a burden, it only gets you thinking. Items and questlines can go across multiple runs, and weapons can retroactively unlock early game pathways. You'll unlock different spawn points and ways to mess with time itself, granting you some precious extra seconds to do even more the next time around. From front to back, not a single pixel is misplaced. It's one of the tightest games around, with an indie dev spirit and focused vision that you just can't help but love. Or at least, I couldn't. Number 4, Sniper Elite 4. Sometimes you just can't beat a damn good third-person shooter. Across the 2000s especially, Gears of War's influence was everywhere. While Sniper Elite is way more MGS5-style open-world stealth than run-and-gun cover shooter, it's a reminder that a distance perspective in a tactile shooter is a great way to engage scores of enemies at once. Picking a route through a level and busting out the occasional melee kill is just a great way to play. Sniper Elite's shtick has long been following any bullet in super slow motion to its target, but this 4th installment is actually a franchise best. Thanks to expertly designed levels, great abilities, fun equipment, and weapons with the perfect amount of kick, developers Rebellion are going to need to dig even deeper if they're ever going to improve on this. Number 3, Mad Max. Missed off many people's to-buy lists thanks to dropping on the exact same day as Metal Gear Solid 5, Mad Max never got a look in because hardly anybody even knew it existed. And that's a shame, because what Avalanche Studios put together has brilliantly impactful vehicle combat, with experimental in-motion abilities to win the day, twinned with Arkham-style brawling and a handful of survival mechanics. You'll need to find petrol to fuel your customizable ride, stock up on water to withstand the more harsh parts of the environment, and the storms? Mad Max's hurricanes are a feast for the eyes. Just trying to stay alive without being flattened by a piece of debris is exhilarating in itself. All of the aforementioned mechanics are spread across a sizable and rewarding open world, one dotted with outposts to take over, vehicles to collect, parts to craft, and more insane mission givers than every GTA combined. It's great. Number 2, Fury. Hands down the coolest game on PS4 if you're anything of a synthwave fan, Fury has an original soundtrack scored by heavyweights in the genre, including Carpenter Brute, Waveshaper, and the Toxic Avenger. Though it's the gameplay being a top-down hack and slash with heavy elements of bullet hell that really make it fun. Combined, it makes up a series of boss fights where your reactions, timing, and memorizations of patterns will be pushed to the absolute limit, all being themed around a lone cyber samurai escaping a prison in the heavens. In between the duels are wandering passages where you can catch your breath and take in the world designed by Afro samurai artist Takashi Okazaki. But just from a pure gameplay standpoint, Fury is tight, relentless, and rewarding as hell. Mixing isometric projectile sections and camera-zoomed one-on-one fighting game sequences, Fury is a visual, audio, and sensory feedback feast. Honestly, I can't recommend it enough.
Much like a filmmaker inevitably becomes associated with their best work, the same thing happens to video game studios, where we really attach them to their most acclaimed titles. While there's nothing wrong with celebrating developers for their greatest achievements, the downside is that some of their lesser-known creations consequently don't get the attention they deserve. Though some of these games eventually become rediscovered as cult classics, there are just as many, if not more, excellent games that are buried under the successes of the studio's other releases, eventually becoming forgotten about by most players. Whatever the reason, it's easy to see how a game from even the most iconic studios can be overlooked. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 painfully overlooked video games from iconic studios. Number 10, Hybrid Heaven, 1999, Konami. A developer so influential within the industry that they have a cheat code named after them, Konami is the studio responsible for heavy hitters like Metal Gear, Silent Hill, and Castlevania. However, there are just as many gems hidden within their treasure trove of releases that people don't know about. One such underrated achievement is Hybrid Heaven. Released in 1999 for the Nintendo 64, this title was a hugely ambitious game for its time. It blended elements from different genres to tell a story as over-the-top as any of the studio's other madcap outings. In it, players take on the role of Mr. Diaz, a human-alien hybrid who turns on his creators at the start of the game. Heading deep into the alien's lair located under New York, players uncover a twisting plot as they work to dismantle the invaders' plans to take over humanity. Alongside its bonkers story, the game's unique mix of shooting, puzzle solving, and wrestling, all of which is wrapped up in an action RPG, made for a delightful concoction of gameplay mechanics. Despite its ideas sounding like they shouldn't work on paper, Hybrid Heaven managed to pull everything off in classic Konami fashion. Number 9, Brutal Legend, 2008, Double Fine. Tim Schafer is video game royalty, whose mind has helped spawn adored cult gems like Grim Fandango, Full Throttle, Day of the Tentacle, and Psychonauts, the latter of which was developed by Schafer's own studio, Double Fine. Alongside the colorful platformer and its sequel, Double Fine is also responsible for the likes of Costume Quest, The Cave, and remasters of some of Schafer's older work. Given the consistently high caliber of this studio's work, it's disappointing that Brutal Legend isn't given the praise it deserves. Starring the voice talents of Jack Black as guitar roadie Eddie Riggs, the plot sees players transported into a heavy metal-inspired world that's overrun with demons. Complete with a face-shredding soundtrack, Schafer's signature sense of humor, and fast-paced hack-and-slash combat, this game was an absolute blast. Despite having an enormous marketing campaign, this one struggled to sell well. It certainly didn't help that all of the game's advertisements hid the fact that it was a real-time strategy game. While Brutal Legend continues to be overlooked by wider audiences, its quirky charms and array of fun ideas has garnered it a much-deserved cult following in the years since. Number 8. Armored Core, 1997, From Software. While they're best known for the deviously difficult Soulsborne titles, From Software have created plenty of other excellent games, with the likes of bombastic action game Ninja Blade and ghostly VR outing Deracine being just some that have slipped under the radar for most players. However, it's the Japanese developers' acclaimed Armored Core series that is among some of the best hidden gems, especially the first title. Set within a dystopian near future, this unsung classic puts players in control of their own giant mech, the eponymous Armored Cores, as they took on various missions for warring corporations. Although graphics haven't aged that well since it released in 1997, gameplay was remarkably ahead of its time. Not only was there an incredible depth to the customization so players could design their mechs how they saw fit, but the narrative would also unfold based on which of the available missions you chose to undertake. More importantly, missions themselves were varied and tons of fun to play. With Armored Core 6 becoming a huge hit this year, it's the perfect time to revisit the title that started it all. Number 7. Edge of Nowhere, 2016, Insomniac. Between Spyro the Dragon, Ratchet & Clank, and Marvel's Spider-Man, Insomniac have no shortage of beloved classics and critical gems. However, the lesser-known Edge of Nowhere sort of stands out from the pack as it never received that much critical or consumer attention. A VR horror game for the Oculus Rift, this title was unlike anything else the studio had made before. Inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's novella The Mountains of Madness, the plot follows protagonist Victor Howard setting out on an expedition to Antarctica in search of his missing fiancée. Before he can find her, though, a plane crash strands him in the snowy wilderness where he finds himself facing various kinds of monstrous horrors. With the world warping and twisting around you as part of this 6-hour story, it's never entirely clear what is actually happening and what's just happening within Victor's mind. By putting the players directly into this Lovecraftian nightmare via VR, they become fully immersed within the inescapably chilling atmosphere that's made all the better by superbly creepy sound design. While it's not their best game, Edge of Nowhere is nevertheless a shining example of what Insomniac can achieve. Number 6. Jade Empire, 2005, Bioware. Although they have admittedly had some recent missteps, Bioware's legacy with the likes of Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and Baldur's Gate 2 have given them a well-earned great standing within the games industry. Before they skyrocketed to acclaim with Mass Effect, however, the developers released Jade Empire, a 2005 Xbox exclusive which has since slipped into the realm of obscurity for most players in the years since. An RPG inspired by Chinese mythology, the plot sees players take on the role of the last spirit monk, as they set out on a quest to defeat a tyrannical emperor and rescue their close friend and tutor in the process. Containing ancient spirits, assassins, and godlike beings, Jade Empire and its world is as grand and full of detail as any of BioWare's other RPG outings, and it's all the better for it. Moreover, a karma system and dialogue choices that actually matter help you shape the narrative as you go. There's also a fluid combat system making players feel like a martial arts master. Despite receiving universal acclaim on release, middling sales figures stopped Jade Empire getting a sequel, with it now only being fondly remembered by those who played it. Number 5. Jet Force Gemini, 1999, Rare. From Perfect Dark, Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye 007, and Sea of Thieves, Rare are a studio that's been delivering for decades. Alongside such all-time classics and cult favorites, the English developer have also released plenty of games that never received the attention they deserve. A third-person shooter released for the N64 in 1999, Jet Force Gemini's plot follows two siblings and their canine companion, all members of the eponymous team of galactic law enforcers, who then become stranded on an alien world after their ship is attacked by a villainous alien bug named Misa. The team must fight back against the bug army and liberate the planet's peaceful natives. Like Rare's other titles, the game is just riddled with this vibrant personality that is boosted by colorful visuals. Alongside the fast-paced and highly entertaining arcade-like combat, exploration was another huge part of what made this game fantastic. With each playable character able to use specific abilities to reach new areas, there was something interesting to discover around every corner. Now that there's an updated version of this game included in Rare Replay, players can experience one of Rare's best unknown games. Number 4. Midnight Club Los Angeles, 2008, Rockstar. An absolute titan of the industry, you'd know Rockstar from their works on Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption, the cult classic The Warriors, and the controversial Manhunt 2. There isn't another studio like Rockstar out there today, but even a developer of this caliber has a handful of games that aren't widely talked about. In this case, that game is Midnight Club Los Angeles. The fourth and final entry into the street racing franchise, which hasn't seen the light of day in over a decade, this title saw players take to the streets in a highly detailed version of Los Angeles for a series of action-packed street races, each as thrilling as the last. The game was visually spectacular for the time, with a day and night cycle and weather system adding to a great sense of immersion. Add in an impressive selection of highly customizable cars, excellent driving controls, and a bombastic soundtrack, and this becomes one of the best racing games of the Xbox 360 era. Given the massive leaps in graphical fidelity since the game first came out, it'd be the perfect time for the series to make a comeback. Number 3. Pentiment, 2022, Obsidian Entertainment. The creators of Knights of the Old Republic 2, Pillars of Eternity, Outer Worlds, and Fallout New Vegas, Obsidian Entertainment are one of the few developers who've rarely put a foot wrong throughout their entire existence. It's disappointing then that one of their most recent games, which also happens to be a masterpiece, unfortunately flew under the radar, and that's Pentiment. Released at the tail end of 2022, this aesthetically gorgeous game takes place in medieval Bavaria, where protagonist Andreas has started an apprenticeship in a monastery, only to become swept up in a murder mystery. With limited time each day, players must decide which leads to follow and which of the locals to spend time with. From here, the plot expands into a grand tale that spans decades and carefully examines the choices you make. Just as compelling as the intriguing narrative is the game's art style, which looks like a medieval manuscript come to life. Combined with the thoughtful dialogue, a serene soundtrack that's as striking as the visuals, and a fantastic eye for historical detail, Pentiment quickly immerses players within its beautifully realized world. It's unlike anything the studio has made before, but it's nevertheless another wonderful Obsidian game. Number 2. Peter Jackson's King Kong, 2005, Ubisoft. After being founded in 1986, Ubisoft have gone on to develop some of the biggest blockbuster titles in recent years, with Assassin's Creed, Splinter Cell, and Far Cry being just some of the iconic games from the French studio. One of the studio's most underrated achievements, however, is undoubtedly Peter Jackson's King Kong. Also known by the longer title, Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie, oh yes, this game is one of the best movie adaptations ever created. Part of which was thanks to Jackson's personal involvement in its development to ensure it stayed true to his film. Flip between playing as scriptwriter Jack Driscoll and the titular giant ape, the game takes players into the heart of Skull Island, where they'll fight hordes of ferocious and frightening monsters. With limited ammo and HUD features being disabled by default, you were forced to create makeshift weapons and use your wits to survive genuinely tense situations. Meanwhile, Kong used his immense size and strength to take down bigger foes and traverse the jungle environments. Presented in a grand cinematic style, the game was epic in every sense of the word. Number 1. Oni, 2001, Bungie. Since establishing themselves in the 90s with the Marathon series, Bungie have become synonymous for blockbuster titles Halo and Destiny, both of which revolutionized the shooter genre in a multitude of ways. One of their games that doesn't get anywhere near the same amount of praise, though, is Oni. Heavily inspired by anime classics like Ghost in the Shell and Akira, Oni takes place in a dystopian future where pollution has made the planet almost uninhabitable. Players take control of Konoko, an elite member of a police task force who soon discovers her government employers have been lying to her about her past. Determined to uncover the truth, she fights against various higher-ups and a dangerous criminal organization in a fun, twisting narrative. In addition to a stylish anime-inspired presentation, the combat was the star of the show. Combining third-person shooting with fluid melee brawling, executing Konoko's arsenal of flashy moves was hugely satisfying. Moreover, clever ideas like enemies only having one magazine of ammo put a unique twist on combat that hasn't been seen in many games since. Unfortunately, with the release of Halo Combat Evolved coming just a year later, Oni was sort of doomed to become just a fond memory.
The Last of Us, The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2. It is safe to say that a strong single-player campaign can help etch a video game title into history. While multiplayer experiences and sandbox titles can give you incredibly fun times, there's nothing quite like grabbing a controller and delving right into an epic story with only yourself for company. But you know what? Sometimes video game projects get overlooked, and we're gonna give them their official time to shine now. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 criminally overlooked single-player campaigns. Number 10, Mafia 3. The Mafia series is, in many ways, a more organised version of GTA. Now, that's less a comment on gameplay or structure and more a reference to the Mafia-based crime syndicates themselves. The games have done well, but the third really deserves more of a spotlight. Mafia 3 has you playing as a Vietnam veteran named Lincoln Clay, who lives in the fictional city of New Bordeaux. He's forced to return to a life of crime after he and his adoptive family are brought into a conflict with the local mafia, and you control Lincoln as he seeks revenge against the organization and builds his own criminal empire. Now, while the game is far from being perfect, it brings a lot of elements together to complete a beautiful picture. The story is fantastic with some unique documentary-style cutscenes, plus the character development for Lincoln is definitely solid, especially in the explorations of racism across 1960s America. Additionally, the combat is, while sometimes repetitive, satisfying as all hell, especially those brutal finishes. Now, the game didn't score great reviews thanks to a lack of technical finesse, but you know what? Its awesome campaign will leave you very satisfied. Number 9, Mirror's Edge. Now, free running in a video game is not usually the point. Often it's just a means to an end, playing a part in the traversal of the world but never acting as a main feature. Dying Light, Assassin's Creed, Prince of Persia and more have you using it, but Mirror's Edge will make you scream parkour, parkour, hardcore parkour, because it is the biggest selling point. This 2008 game puts you in the very bright red shoes of a runner named Faith, who lives in a near-future city ruled by a tyrannical government. You control her in first person, using her impressive free-running skills to uncover a grand conspiracy and try and save her sister's life after she's wrongfully accused of murdering a politician. Now, while the story isn't exactly deep, it's the sheer intensity and fluidity of the parkour that mesmerizes and brings everything together. A decent player can break through levels at blistering speeds, with the campaign acting as a brilliant way to constantly test yourself with new settings, characters, and challenges. The game did turn some heads and was even able to produce a prequel years after its release in the form of Mirror's Edge Catalyst. Still, not enough people remember this utterly unique single-player experience. Number 8, Knack 2. Now, the release of the first Knack game was, well, pretty disastrous, despite what Donkey will tell you. It was a launch title with the PS4 and became the butt of many jokes thanks to its mediocre gameplay and desperate attempts to establish a new PlayStation mascot. But you know what? The sequel? Well, it's not half bad. Knack 2 saw the return of the titular character, creating a stronger experience all round. It ironed out many of the first game's biggest kinks, such as poor checkpointing and harsh difficulty, and it also increased the scale, adding more to do and lengthening the already quite generous runtime of its campaign. This general mix of platforming and beat-em-up combat was nicely enjoyable in its simplicity. Tragically, even though Knack 2 does a much better job and has a rather enjoyable campaign, the stink of the last game was still lingering. Unsurprisingly, this fell into obscurity, but it is still worth a play if you ever want a chunky platformer with some rather cool ideas and an off-kilter style. Number 7, Assassin's Creed Unity. Now, the release of Assassin's Creed Unity is one of the most infamous in all of gaming. In many ways, it was the predecessor to the modern trope of releasing a game before it's fully finished, as seen in the likes of No Man's Sky, Cyberpunk 2077, Fallout 76, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and many, many more. And yet, if you give this one another go-around, you might actually be surprised. You see, Unity takes players to France during the revolutionary years between 1789 and 1794. It puts you in control of an assassin named Arnaud, who attempts to uncover the secrets behind the revolution and gain revenge for the murder of his adoptive father. There is also naturally a 21st century framing device, but nobody really cares about that. Now, it is by no means a groundbreaking story akin to the best of the Ubisoft franchise's portfolio, but Unity is far more playable now and nowhere near as bad as you remember, and for this, it deserves a lot more positive attention. The title's simplicity harkens back to the franchise's old days, providing a very tight and compact assassin experience. The Paris setting is also beautifully depicted, and the stealth combat mechanics are deeply enjoyable. Looking back, it's really an encapsulation of what made this series so awesome. Number 6. Fable 3. Fans of the chicken-kicking, binary choice-making, Peter Molyneux-faking Fable series are often quick to label this game as the worst in the franchise, and truthfully, the conclusion to the trilogy certainly does have its problems, like the reductive combat system and playable start menu, but you know what? The campaign definitely has a lot to offer. You see, Fable 3 puts you in the shoes of a prince who is the descendant of the central hero from the previous game. You get drawn into a royal rebellion to stop the malicious onslaught of your brother King Logan, and this adventure sees you travel across the land of Albion, making important allies. However, you soon come to learn that power definitely has consequences. And spoilers for the game here, although it's likely you already know, but one of the biggest surprises in Fable 3 is that it goes past the point that a regular story would. Once you conquer the throne, you'll have to run it and soon learn that many of the optimistic promises that you've made along the way must actually be broken for the greater good of the kingdom. You can say what you want about Fable, but the ambitious story, rich voice cast, varied locations, classic Fable humor, and fun side quests don't get the credit they deserve. Hopefully the upcoming reboot can certainly grab more acclaim. Number 5. Half-Life Alyx. Now, anyone who expects the announcement of Half-Life 3 in 2023 is rather optimistic to say the least. Still, there is a solid modern title that, while not being a third installment per se, is a great return to Half-Life. Sadly though, barely anyone has played it. Half-Life Alyx lets you shockingly play as Alex in the prequel to the second game. However, unlike the previous titles, this first-person shooter was developed exclusively for Valve's Vive VR headset. Shooting mechanics are tight and seamless level design captures the magic of the original Valve games. The campaign is also a 12-hour-long delight that delivers a great story with some excellent character development for our titular heroine. Of course, part of what caused people to give this one a miss was its VR requirements, which meant that you needed to shell out a pricey sum just to play it. Gabe Newell, the president of Valve, called the game a forward investment, linking the motivation for making it more towards the technological future of the industry as opposed to creating a highly profitable Half-Life game. And that's all well and good, but there's no denying that the majority of fans, well, they kind of missed out because they couldn't afford it. Number 4. Immortals Phoenix Rising. Whenever a seminal video game releases with a whole new approach to gameplay, it's easy to assume that you're going to get a few clones. Well, if The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the original, this game is its mini-me. But Immortals' is rich campaign full of action, creativity, humor, and mythology is way more knock-out than knock-off. Immortals Phoenix Rising is an action-adventure game set in ancient Greece, told through the lens of a conversation between Zeus and Prometheus. The latter describes the tale of Phoenix, a mortal who must battle the monster Typhoon in order to save their home. In order to do this, your custom hero ventures across the land, searching for the legendary gods of Olympus. One thing the game certainly deserves credit for is its sheer creativity and humor. It approaches its structures like Breath of the Wild, letting you venture into whatever region you want with multiple recognizable deities to meet and save, and each provides their own hilarious story, such as Ares, the god of war, being turned into a rooster, or Athena being transformed into a child. These segments come together to form a grand adventure that you will sink hours into, with a visually bombastic open world and plenty of satisfying physics puzzles as well. And while the game did well enough, it flew under most people's radars when it came to the story. Number 3. Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. Call of Duty is a franchise that either gets you hyped to the max or will make you groan. This Activision series was the industry's undisputed king in the early 2010s, but as the franchise continued, fans grew fatigued, forcing the developers to work harder in order to maintain their attention. So they decided to go to space, and everybody hated it. The release of the first trailer for Infinite Warfare was met with frustration from consumers, even leading it to becoming the second most disliked YouTube video at the time. But if you check out the comments section of that video now, you'll find that many people are taking those dislikes back. The campaign has aged like a fine wine, leaving many to change their tune. Infinite Warfare's campaign sees you fight for the solar system in an action-packed sci-fi adventure. The writing and acting are surprisingly solid as you take control of an American Marine named Reyes battling against the evil Settlement Defense Force, which is led, lest we not forget, by Game of Thrones' own Kit Harington. Additionally, the space combat is pretty damn fun, giving you plenty of things to do such as hacking, piloting spacecrafts, and even optional side missions. Sometimes a series' overhype and exposure leaves you acting as a harsher critic than usual, but it's worth picking this one up now again just to see how you feel about it now. Number 2. Max Payne 3. Max Payne 3 takes the titular hero out of his New York setting and to Brazil, where he works as a private security contractor for the Branco family. However, he's soon forced into action again after a street gang kidnaps the youngest, Fabiana, and the story follows Max as he attempts to get her back. While many lamented the loss of the neo-noir aesthetic, the change of the game's location and brighter style managed to reinvent the property without ruining its integrity. Besides fresh visuals and strong character development, Max Payne 3 also thrives with its excellent use of the bullet time mechanic, giving you copious kill cams and excuses for cinematic flair, all of which is so thrilling to see that you never get tired of it. The game sold well, even becoming the highest grossing in the Max Payne series, but its higher budget made it a commercial failure, which is honestly unfair, as this Rockstar developed title still deserves an audience today. And number 1, Titanfall 2. As a sequel to a game that was mostly recognized for being a decent multiplayer exclusive FPS, Titanfall 2 really had no right to be as good as it was. It's genuinely one of the most engaging and fascinating first-person shooters ever made, and yet it received all of the attention of an unsupervised kid at a playground. Titanfall 2 follows Jack Cooper, an infantry rifleman turned Titan pilot, and his Titan BT. The pair are forced to fight against the Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation as they seek to launch a superweapon that threatens planetary destruction. And the campaign features everything from mech battles to tight shooting and even to bloody time travel, bringing all of the fun exoskeleton mechanics and impressive free running of its predecessor. However, as developers Respawn apparently thought of a series of set pieces first before then writing the story around them, Titanfall 2 ups the ante in every respect. This highly ambitious story feels massive in scale and never gets boring, thanks to its varied locations and changing mechanics. Plus, the relationship between Jack and BT, well, it's incredibly charming. And it is criminal how overlooked this phenomenal and easily recommendable game has been.
Sony's first 2 consoles were absolute behemoths, with massive back catalogues of all things action and scary, from outright horror to imitations of the Resident Evil formula, for better or worse. So with clenched teeth and sweaty palms, let's take a look, in no particular order, at some of the best pant wetters we had back in the day. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 underrated survival horror games on PS1 and PS2. Number 10. Galerians. Released at a time when Resident Evil fervor was high, Galerians eschewed traditional gun-based combat over the psychic powers the protagonist Ryan has. Keeping the fixed camera angles of its zombie contemporary, Galerians still employed a conservative inventory system, much like Resident Evil. The psychic abilities that Ryan has are maintained by a drug that tops up his usage of them, and these are a finite resource. Furthermore, using too much of its power too often resulted in Ryan suffering a rage-like burst that would kill anyone around him, but also himself if used for too long. Set in a similar vein to Free Radical's Second Sight, with amnesia and experimentation gone wrong, the story and look of this game was more emulative of Eastern anime, in particular Akira. Rogue AIs and god complexes aplenty, Galerians was a great twist on the template that Capcom laid out with its series. Spawning a sequel on the PS2 a few years after, nothing much has happened to Galerians since. If you have the inclination for more old-school Resi-style games, it's worth digging this or its sequel out. Number 9. Ghost Hunter.
Look beneath that early 2000s veneer and you've got a cracking third-person adventure that dabbles in the realm of soul and supernatural. As Officer Lazarus Jones, that's right, on his first day, he and colleague Anna Steele are sent to investigate strange noises at a school that saw a professor murder 10 students and disappear 10 years prior. Or so it starts. But past that opening bluff, the story unfolds into one of resurrected fallen knights and the discovery of ghosts living alongside us. You discover the professor didn't murder the students, as your bumbling releases both him from captor and the ghosts he'd also contained along the way. It had a decent gunplay and capture element featuring a wireless version of the Ghostbusters trap, as you jump into different locales based on the framed professor's research, including a backwater manor house, a penitentiary, and a ghost ship. It had a stellar cast too, including veteran voice actor Rob Paulsen, Terminator 2's Joe Morton, and even Sir Michael Gambon. Graphically, it was also well received and scored very well across the board. Sadly, that's the last we've heard from Ghost Hunter, as it seems to have faded into obscurity. Number 8. Obscure. If the last game was visually a product of its time, then obscure would be defined by the films of its time. Coming at a time when teen slasher films were experiencing a renaissance, with sequels from Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Scream, as well as the first Saw movie a year before, obscure wasn't lacking for inspiration. Again, set against the backdrop of experimentation and human subjects, Obscure saw our group of teenagers locked in their school overnight and having to face hordes of mutated students. Playing as one of 5 students, each bringing their own differing abilities to the gameplay, the game also allowed a second player to jump in as your partner. Using a brightness mechanic later expanded on in Alan Wake, the gameplay of Obscure was again not to be an all-out hero, but to focus on survival whilst uncovering the mystery happening at your school. Obscure did well enough to warrant a sequel, but that was quite literally more of the same, right down to the characters, and nothing has been made of the series since. Number 7. Clock Tower 3. A massive departure from the original point-and-click Clock Tower games, the third game chose third-person adventure instead. Overseen by Battle Royale director Kinji Fukasaku, CT3 is a more survival-focused affair than its puzzle-orientated predecessors. The story itself is a bit loopy in its premise. 14-year-old protagonist Alyssa Hamilton discovers she's part of a lineage of time-traveling, spirit-battling warriors, as she's been sent from 2003 to the 1940s and 60s to battle evil entities. Armed with a bottle of holy water, gameplay was geared more towards chase and hide than stand and fight. That is until the end of each mission, when your holy water would transform into a crossbow to take out the monster of the week mission entity. It was a juxtaposing change to the format that became a bit repetitive each time around. Whilst by no means the best entry on this list, Clock Tower 3's departure from its original gameplay at least tried something different, which did mean polarizing reviews and lack of commercial success on release. Number 6. Extermination. Coming as part of a trilogy of entries set in cold climates, we'll get the ball rolling with Extermination. Released in the early days of the PS2's lifespan, Extermination was another third-person horror/shooter akin to Resident Evil. Its setting was praised for being somewhat different to the PS1's catalog. As a member of the US Marine Corps sent to investigate an Antarctic research base's distress signal, things go awry from the start, including the team's entry to the base, and you suddenly discover why the distress signal was actually asking for the base to be airstriked instead. The main draw to Extermination was the dichotomy in its shooter gameplay. It handled well and encouraged you to blend running away with taking enemies out, but also offering limited ammunition, even to the point that it wouldn't replenish once picked up either. As much as can be said for Extermination, it was a solid action horror for its time, vastly outdated by the time Resi 4 came around, but still a great title for near-launch PS2 fans. Number 5. Cold Fear. The second entry in the trilogy, Cold Fear was the second game from the team behind 2001's Alone in the Dark reboot for the PS1. Set in Russian waters aboard a whaling ship in the Bering Strait, our hero is tasked with aiding the doomed vessel. As a member of the Coast Guard, unlikely hero Tom Hansen isn't a walking bullet sponge equipped to the gills with firepower. Instead, faced against a parasitic entity and the involvement of third-party forces, Hansen is thrown in the deep end not long from the start and has to uncover
what's what. Technically, it was an impressive game. Characters and objects reacted with the swaying boat and tidal conditions, which added some instability to the combat. There was no inventory system, so medicinal items were used on the fly, and ammo was only held to the limit of the equipped weapons, adding an element of tactics over hoarding. Sadly, Cold Fear torpedoed. Despite good reviews, the Resi 4 comparisons essentially scuttled any promise, and it sank amidst the wave of more successful games. Number 4, The Thing. Our final entry in the trilogy, The Thing is a unique game. Set as a sequel to John Carpenter's 1982 movie of the same name, The Thing follows a team of US Special Forces operatives following the events at the end of the movie. Whilst not graphically revolutionary, nor the shooting action being anything remarkably new to the formula, it did offer something brilliant instead, a fear-trust mechanic. What that meant is that any NPCs you meet along the way could either trust the player character Blake or suspect him of being a thing. Differing levels of trust meant that people could be insubordinate or blindly loyal, freaking out and having heart attacks, killing themselves or others, or sabotaging the environment. It also utilized an infection probability system that meant that anytime an enemy is faced, characters are liable to become infected sooner, and therefore transform and become an enemy themselves. The Thing, the game, was a decent survival horror if you weren't satisfied with the cliffhanger events of the film, and hankered some new gameplay mechanics. Number 3, Forbidden Siren. We'd be remiss to ignore the faults that immediately present themselves when playing Forbidden Siren: the stealth, the weirdly out-of-place facial mapping, and the oddly paced episodic structure. But for its faults, there's actually a relatively solid horror game in here. Much like Obscure taking Western influence from films, the Siren series draws inspiration from film contemporaries like The Ring and The Grudge, to name a few. Keeping combat to a bare minimum and as a means of incapacitating overkilling, sneaking past the Shibito was the favored method of progression. Utilizing a feature called sight jacking, it allowed you to see from the perspective of nearby enemies and work out patterns of patrol. Commercially successful and spawning out a few sequels, Forbidden Siren paved the way for hide-and-seek-a-thons like Outlast and Alien Isolation for years to come. Whether we'll see it again is another thing, but if you're after some retro sneaking horror, it's absolutely worth checking out. Number 2, Fatal Frame / Project Zero. Another game in a similar vein to Forbidden Siren, in that the emphasis is based on more looming horror and little combat. Fatal Frame is another slice of Japanese horror. Fatal Frame, or Project Zero as it's known in Europe, mixes third-person exploration and first-person non-combat. Using an antique camera known as the camera obscura, that's the only means of capturing and pacifying ghosts in the mansion you're investigating. Set in the 80s, the game had you searching for your missing sibling in said mansion, whilst encountering the malicious souls of those that have entered and presumably perished before you. Armed with your camera and a pseudo-sixth sense ability to locate nearby ghosts, the game wasn't above the odd jump scare as you lock your viewfinder on the spooks. Paving the way for modern ideas as seen in Outlast and its sequels, Fatal Frame is still a strong-going series. If you do still have a PS2 hooked up, it's worth checking out the first two if you fancy playing some heritage spookers. Number 1, Parasite Eve 2. Whilst the first one favored a more tactical RPG/vagrant story approach to battling, the sequel saw a more direct comparison to Resident Evil, as well as a much more welcome European release. Cleverly blending a light sense of RPG into its battle system, because this was Squaresoft riding high on the Final Fantasy train, it made battle a more tactical experience, rather than just shooting the thing until they fall down. Various weapons and ammunition types were available, as well as different armors and items to aid in defense. One new element that separated it from the Capcom contemporary, though, was the use of protagonist Aya Brea's powers. Continuing the first game's story themes of mitochondrial manipulation and the scientific endeavors gone wrong, Aya had a strong arsenal of offensive and defensive powers to turn the tide of battle. There is an amazing story, too, completing a graphically impressive game. It'd be nice to see more of Parasite Eve, but nothing's really been announced since the underwhelming performance of the PSP exclusive PE Third Birthday.